Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining me in this session of UNC1860 and the Temple of Oats, during which we're going to be untangling a non-traditional attribution story about an Iranian access brokerage group. I am Staff Schulman, staff security researcher for Google Threat Intelligence, expert in reverse engineering and tracking and hunting of different threat actors, mainly ones that are operating in Israel and the Middle East. On our agenda for today, we'll begin by even understanding what is this session going to be about. We'll then actually start from the end of my research and get ourselves familiarized with this access brokerage group. We'll review seemingly unrelated pieces of evidence I've collected throughout my research, and then I'll walk you through my aha moments where I could finally piece everything together. Lastly, we'll summarize and conclude. And so without any further ado, let's begin. So why am I even here, and what will we be talking about? So I do CTI research, and I was well under the impression that whenever I approach cases with the one goal of attributing them to one singular threat group, I would be able to lay down all my evidence and artifacts into the classic attack lifecycle, where I can clearly see a cohesive threat cluster, I can see the different stages in an operation, what is happening during every stage, and how do they all come together to achieve the one complete mission goal. But my entire perception had been shattered when I encountered a rather strange case, where instead of having this, I ended up getting that. I started reviewing different IR investigations around the Middle East and around Middle Eastern entities. And even though from the very beginning, I got this very strong sense that I keep on seeing the same threat group again and again and again, when I lay down all of my evidence, I got this weird-looking attack lifecycle. They were different hops between different stages there, and for the complete mission goal, they were like 3 or 4 different ones. Some looked like access brokerage handoffs. Some were destructive, some were espionage, some activities were non-handoff independent, and in some cases were even just jumpings in between the two. And so even though at this point the feeling about the attribution was very, very strong, let me tell you, the evidence at this point were not so much. And so bear with me, as for the next 30 minutes or so, I'm going to walk you through and explain to you my thought process and the steps I could take in order to attribute all these different scattered events into one single threat group that would otherwise be tracked as several different ones. But before we deep dive into the technical details, let's actually start from the end of the research and get ourselves all familiarized with what we now know about this threat. So this group I'll be describing today is called UNC1860. They had been operating since at least 2016. They are affiliated with the Iranian Ministry of Intelligence and Security, and we have some low confidence evidence to suggest they are related with the Iranian APT-34. UNC1860's targeting is very Middle Eastern centric, but in some cases we do see them opt to target the US or Europe. They're essentially interested in anything that is interesting, I guess, but more specifically, they do really like governments, telecommunications, media entities, critical infrastructures, and satellite providers. UNC1860 operates both as their own independent group as well as an access broker for additional Iranian groups, and they are just phenomenal R&D experts in their craft. Now, a little bit of background into UNC1860's toolbox and techniques. So this group exclusively relies on one-day vulnerabilities. They are very fond of using some small homebrewed web shells they create simply to load additional pieces of code and payloads. They deploy custom obfuscation schemes on their toolings, and they only ever use, create, and rely on passive pieces of toolings, so nothing that ever contains any trackable embedded infrastructure or that will ever generate any outbound communication. They create vast, massive amounts of these toolings. Some are small .NET utilities that perform very, very specific tasks, and some are very robust drivers and backdoors. The group maintain an arsenal of what we track as GUI-operated backdoor controllers. And as access brokers, UNC1860 is very much both willing and able to facilitate handoff operations for both destructive and espionage operations. On the screen right now, you can see different examples of different destructive activities that were taking place around the Middle East in the last couple of years. These caught lots of public's attention, and you might even be familiar with some of these. Even though they seem independent and unrelated, following this research, we can actually confirm that the one group that actually accessed and enabled all of these destruction was UNC1860. While they were facilitating these, they were enabling and handoffing deep dive Iranian-sponsored espionage operations in the Middle East. And while all of this is happening, they're still maintaining their own independent activities, targeting critical infrastructures and telecommunication providers in the region. Now that we all know and love UNC1860, I want to take you back from this point to the point back in time of the gathering evidence phase of my research. We'll review different pieces of artifacts that ended up playing key part in this attribution story. As mentioned before, due to the lack of any trackable infrastructure and the vast amounts of code created by this group, most of these artifacts would rely on malware families and toolings. Over here, you can now see just a fraction of the entirety of UNC1860's arsenal. We could spend hours describing each of these malware families independently, but we don't have the time for that. And we've already been through two main categories of these. So we've mentioned the small homebrewed web shells and the small .NET utilities. We'll now highlight additional pieces of malware that were crucial for this story, but do not fall under any of these two categories. And so this first malware I want to highlight, it's a personal favorite of mine, and it's the Oats and its descendants. Oats is a C++-based shellcode launcher. It's used to load an embedded payload. In the wild, this was either a tofu load or tofu pipe shellcode launchers themselves. They're also C++-based, but they will not launch an embedded shellcode. They will receive it from an external source. They will do it by implementing passive listeners, tofu pipe over named pipes, and tofu load over HTTPS. All three of them will eventually implement and load the same unique UNC1860 shellcode struct. As I've said earlier, UNC1860 is very much capable of creating very robust driver toolings. Two of them that we've seen repetitively in the wild are called WinTopics and Tofu Drive. WinTopics is a driver that's used to launch an embedded shellcode, which in turn unpacks a backdoor into memory. And Tofu Drive will set up passive HTTPS-based listeners for, you could have probably guessed, get another shellcode and launch it. Finishing up the malware families portion with the Temple's ecosystem. This ecosystem is constructed of 5 distinct pieces of malware, and if I may say so, their names are pretty self-explanatory. It starts with the Temple dropper. It's used to execute the Temple door backdoor. It offers a full range of capabilities. It can do arbitrary command execution. It can support some file operations. And actually, the Temple doors capabilities could be enhanced further by using any of 3 unique dependencies, the Temple lock, comp, and core, that will offer additional features of added persistency and some more advanced detections evasions. Now, aside from just massive amounts of toolings that were delivered by the threat group into environments we were investigating, we've uncovered a very interesting behavior where this group would specifically deliver external libraries and dependencies into infected hosts. As of today, we track around 13 pieces of these unique libraries, each performing its own specific task. Today, I'll just highlight the 3 most prominent ones, and they are called by the threat group, not by me, XORO, BC64, and event lock. You could probably guess that XORO is used for XOR encryption and decryption. BC64, and it's compiled with this typo, this is not me, is used for base64 encoding and decoding. And event lock will actually be used to tamper with processes and services related to the Windows event log. Upon first looking at these, I thought to myself that these are very obvious functions. And I couldn't quite wrap my head around why would anyone actually spend time and efforts into creating these functions on their own. But it was a very repetitive, consistent thing. Take, for example, BC64. It was compiled with the typo and firstly delivered at around 2019. It was still going very strong in 2024, so there had to be a make-sense explanation to it. And we've eventually figured out that the group is actually using these libraries to, first of all, avoid some evil function detections. It would be when a security vendor would track down the callings to a legitimate function, like base64 encoding, but it's also very favored by malicious software. And additionally, due to the nature of this group that maintains a very wide and varied base of victims for different purposes operations with different toolings, actually implementing these functions on their own would ensure that the tooling is always compatible no matter the victim or environment. And then the last piece of very intriguing evidence we could fetch was actually the usage and deployment of GUI operated software deployed right there on victims' machines. And these were high-profile, high-value, high-risk victims. It seemed very odd to begin with, and when we've examined these further, we've discovered that these pieces of software are supposed to be used as very easy, self-explanatory malware controllers. They support different commands, and you're supposed to configure the GUI with the address of an infected machine in the network, and you can then deliver some commands to it. The 2 controllers we've discovered are called Temple Play and Vero Green, and Vero Green also has a really interesting feature of automatic scanning and exploitation of SharePoint vulnerabilities in the network. So at this point, the collection of evidence phase is done. And I still have nothing in hand but investigations in the Middle East, unrelated pieces of artifacts, and just a very strong feeling that I do keep on seeing the same threat group again and again and again and again. But I can't match between all the different malware families because they don't have any literal function overlaps between them. I see different operations. Some end in handoffs, some are not, some are espionage, some destructive. And there are opposite approaches to OPSEC. So all the way from uber complex drivers and backdoors to GUI-operated software used right there on victims' hosts. So right now, really nothing is adding up, and we just have to go back and reconsider if this whole theory and feeling about the attribution to just one group could even be plausible. And that was when I started finally having my aha moment. I could finally realize what we could do in order to connect all of these different events one into another. And if we would just seek beyond this infrastructure we're so used to be tracking, and if we look further than the literal function overlaps in code we usually rely on, we might just get, finally, our answers. The first thing I've noticed was that if we take all the different pieces of .NET utilities and we compare them with one another, naturally, they don't have any function overlaps because they do not implement the same functions or do the same things. But all of them do contain the same very funny, strange-looking obfuscated strings. When I deobfuscated all of them, I kept on getting back into the same two deobfuscation schemes. They do not exist anywhere in the wild besides in tooling we suspected would be on UNC1860. These two schemes are called CryptoSlay and OffuSlay. On the right side, you can see the CryptoSlay deobfuscation scheme, and on the left side, you can see the OffuSlay deobfuscation scheme. Both of these are very simple yet effective, and they only rely on hex encodings, then strings reversing, and CryptoSlay has this additional layer of single byte XOR encryption. So this is bingo number one. From there, I went to compare tofu load and tofu drive. Now, they do different things. They are naturally different. One is a driver, one is definitely not. But both of them happen to implement passive HTTPS-based listeners. Both of them happen to implement those passive listeners in the exact same manner. And so both of them would utilize the same exact set of undocumented functions from the Windows HTTP sys in order to implement the passive communication. Now, learning about these functions, let alone learning how to implement them properly, would require vast reverse engineering research, and this does not only emphasizes the amount of expertise that goes behind UNC1860's activities, but also helps me to connect tofu load to tofu drive, even though they have no function overlaps. And it's because the odds that two completely unrelated threat groups would look and seek for the same driver, for the same undocumented functions, and then implement them in the exact same manner is just simply non-existent. When we were looking back into these GUI-operated malware controllers, we finally figured out that they're not just controllers for any backdoors, but actually that this command supported by each of them has an exact match for a backdoor within the UNC1860's arsenal. And so Temple Play is an exact match controller with Temple Door, and Vero Green is an exact match to control the base walk and station Tay proprietary webshells. What is eventually happens in the wild is that UNC1860 access an environment. They infect all the different resources and hosts with these backdoors and the web shells. And then just before heading out, they would leave behind on externally facing resources these controllers, so the Temple Play or the Vero Green. And then any group that chooses to collaborate and have a handoff operation with UNC1860 could maintain and sustain their own activity using the already existing UNC1860's backdoors in the network. They can manage them with ease through the controllers without needing to have any special expertise on the tools or the network itself. So it seems like the odds are finally in my favor, and we could connect all the small .NET utilities. We've connected tofu load to tofu drive. We've matched backdoors to their controllers. So why not taking it a step further? At this point, we've decided to try and compare between the full vast backdoors, some of the small utilities, and some web shells. All we suspected would eventually go back to the same group. Naturally, our tooling couldn't find any overlaps between them because they don't exist in this manner. But when we were examining deeper, we've discovered that across all categories of toolings, wherever functions like XOR encryption or base64 encoding is needed, the functions are actually derived and imported from these funny-sounding libraries discussed earlier. So wherever XOR encryption and decryption is needed, there is the XORO library. Wherever base64 encoding or decoding is needed, there is the base64 library with a notorious typo. And wherever there is tempering of processes and services, event lock is called. And I've mentioned lots and lots of shellcode launchers. Some were drivers, some were not, and some were web shells, and some were not. And even though all of them are different in nature, all of them end up loading and implementing the exact same UNC1860 crafted shellcode struct, so we can connect between them. So I'm now on this role of finding all the technical connections between the scattered pieces of toolings, so why not take it even another step further? And so at this point, we're trying to literally compare the code between C++-based backdoors, small ASPX-based web shells, and then C# implemented utilities. And let me tell you, even though none of these toolings would ever match the same detections or would come up as similar pieces to one another, when we place them one next to each other, we've discovered that some of them are actually exact replicas of one another. And they were just retyped in different languages. And so take, for example, the C++ variant of tofu load. This is the main function that is used to set up passive listeners and eventually load a receive shellcode. Within the small toolings arsenal, there is actually a C# variant of the exact same function. And so the same phenomenon applies as well to the C++ version of tofu load, which would do the exact same thing over named pipes listeners. And this one has its exact match retyped in C#. Taking it another step further, the Oats C++ shellcode launcher, its main function would actually decode the embedded shellcode and then execute it. When we were seeking the UNC1860's arsenal to find its exact match, we suddenly discovered the small ASPX-based SparkLoad web shell that is implementing the exact same scheme. And then finishing up with these two drivers I've mentioned before, WinTapix and Tofu Drive, even though they have no function overlaps between them, they do not implement even similar or the same things. Tofu Drive had this innocently looking API wrapping function. It was retyped in the exact same way with WinTapix. So we now have plenty enough technical evidence to suggest that all these random pieces of code and toolings actually are related to one another. But if we think back at it, they were never so random to begin with, because we fetched all of them throughout investigations we were having across the Middle East. So you can see on the screen right now the exact region where UNC1860's investigations and targeting were taking place. You can clearly see the Middle East. You might think you see this glitch for a UK-based targeting, but this is actually a Middle Eastern entity that just happens to be based in the UK, so all good. And so if we have the same targeting patterns and the same victimology, and not the technical evidence to suggest connections between tools that we wanted, but the technical evidence we needed, if we have all of that, even though we have no infrastructure to track, if we have some operations ending in handoff, some in destruction, and some are not, we can still circle back and connect all of these events back to one another, to one thread group, that is UNC1860. And so we're now headed towards the end of this session. So let's just summarize some of the main points we've just been through. And so I think we could prove that if we take seemingly unrelated and independent pieces of code, they could be still tied strongly enough to one another to verge and to argue for attribution. We've seen that code similarities don't necessarily have to always mean the exact traditional literal function overlaps we usually look for. The attack life cycles for our favorite thread groups don't always have to look the same. They don't have to be traditional to be true and to actually correctly represent what a group is up to. And this just all emphasizes that when we're discussing attribution questions, it's so important to remember to look at the bigger picture of things, rather than just independent small technical bits and bytes. And so what can we do moving forward to track and to attribute the next UNC1860s that are already out there? Well, I believe that we would have to go beyond just tool training for our people. We have to make sure that people are trained as researchers and not just on technical toolings, and that they can question and doubt the tooling's results whenever it is appropriate and needed. And I believe that we would have to go from just technical code analysis and to have this additional holistic layer on it of semantic analysis of actions. So we're no longer going to be satisfied with just, hey, these two functions seem identical. But we want, hey, these two pieces of code seem to be doing very similar things, and they come from very similar nature investigations and victims and environments. And I truly believe that it's only when we make these shifts is when we will not be played by UNC1860s anymore. So thank you, and I'm happy to take any questions either now or afterwards.
Stav, thank you for a phenomenal session, walking us through your research. That was really eye-opening. I have two questions. The first is, do you have any guesstimate around the size of UNC1860? Is it like 5 people, 50 people? Because from all of that overlap, it could seem like maybe there's just like a couple of people who know what they're doing, and they've been kind of reusing their strategies and their tools over time, providing an infrastructure for other threat groups to build upon. So that would be first question. How large is that team? The second is about the naming convention. So tofu, sleigh, oats. I noticed a lot of RuPaul Drag Race references, Shantae, stay, slay, etc. Is that from the attackers, or did you come up with that?
So for the first question, we don't know anything about the potential size of team or how is it looking for the back end for this group. For the naming conventions, it is all me, and I appreciate you noticing the references. Thank you.
You slay.
All right, so if there are no more questions, then thank you again for joining me.